So you want to book a trip, but you feel overwhelmed with the planning process. Well, today I'm going to be going over a step-by-step guide of how you can plan a trip, no matter the length, whether it's a short weekend getaway or a 1+ year around the world trip. Hi, I'm Liz. I've traveled to 45 countries on 6 continents. I'm obsessed with travel. I've done many short trips while working full-time, and I've done a couple of long-term travel trips. The planning process looks quite similar no matter what length of trip, and I feel like over the years I've really honed in on my planning process. So I wanted to create this video. Firstly, I know everybody has their own comfort level while planning trips. I know some people like everything booked way in advance and just that's what they feel comfortable with. And then there's other people who can literally just show up to a place with no plans, chat with the hostel people and hotel people and, you know, build a trip from there. I would consider myself kind of in the moderate to planned category. And so my step-by-step guide is taking that in mind. I like to take advantage of my time in a place. And if I have a good idea of what the big things are to see there and like to make sure I'm not missing out on anything, I like to have a plan. Step number 1, and this is like what I call the brainstorming / fantasizing phase. It's really like the big picture phase of your trip planning process. This is where you really kind of think about like, what type of trip do you want? Are you wanting beaches? Are you wanting hiking? Are you wanting wildlife? Are you wanting culture? If you're wanting food, are you wanting a little bit of multiple things? This is where you really kind of think about, okay, how do I want to use this time? And part of this is to really think about the time you have available, because certain activities in certain places are not doable certain times of year. So for example, if you really wanted to go trek in Nepal, you don't want to do that in June. That's like monsoon season. Definitely keep that in mind, that you'll want to check the weather of where you're wanting to go. Okay, and a note for full-time travel. This is such a fun phase. I feel like Alex and I started with just like brain dumping every place we wanted to go on our around the world trip. So for those of you who don't know, we planned a 1.5 year around the world trip back in 2019. Obviously got cut a little short because of everything that happened in the world in 2020, but it was such a fun phase. Honestly, I have such fun memories from our mornings we spent together fantasizing about this. We started with just doing a brain dump of every place we could possibly imagine we wanted to go around the world. And then from there, we created a wall with months, like 1 month was per paper, and we kind of moved things around, and it was really fun. And it was a great way, I feel like, to visualize that length of a trip. And while we were doing the wall, we were able to narrow it down because we realized our initial fantasizing phase was a 3+ year around the world trip. So we had to really narrow it down, and that really helped us. So once you know where you want to go, this is where the next step comes in. This is that like adding activities phase. I call it kind of like the scoping out phase of your travel planning. This is where you really decide, okay, in this location, I want to do these major activities. Back when we were planning our around the world trip, we used a lot of guidebooks, but we also used blogs and vlogs and Instagram to create these lists. So many people are putting out content out there to really help you plan your trip that at this stage, we don't even really use guidebooks at all. We just use blogs, Instagram, YouTube, that sort of thing to plan our trips. One thing to keep in mind with if you are following different creators online is to think about the style of trip you want. Like I come across blogs where they want to focus on partying, and that's just not me and Alex's vibe whatsoever. So I know kind of to avoid maybe their blogs and to listen to blogs that are more aligned with the type of travel me and Alex like, which we always like to have a lot of outdoor adventure during our travels. We also like culture and food, and so those are kind of the things we focus on during our trips. If you are planning a trip with other people outside your household, one thing I've always found really helpful is to use a Google Sheet. So have a tab that's dedicated to activities you want to do, and then have everybody just brain dump what they want to do. And that way everybody in the trip feels like they have input as well. You want everyone to be happy, so I found that to be really helpful. So one thing that I have found extremely helpful, and I was resistant to do this for a number of years. I'd heard about this, but now I can't live without. This is part of my travel planning phase, and that is as you're researching to pin things on Google Maps. This is, I can't even tell you how helpful, because it helps you kind of know where things are located in the city. So as you're planning your trip, you don't want to have like one day where you're like way across the city and then you're missing something that was nearby the other spot. This really helps you know like where the main activities are clustered together to help you plan best. I even am constantly adding to this as I talk to other travelers, as I see things on social media. I'm constantly adding pins to my Google Maps, and it makes such a difference. And that way you can ensure that you're hitting these big spots that people recommend. So highly recommend doing some pins on Google Maps. I can do a quick demo here where I show you how that's done. You can do it on your computer or you can do it on your phone. So let's do this example first. Rome, find the location you want based on your research, right? And so let's say you want to see the Colosseum. So you click on the Colosseum. And then once you click on the Colosseum, you'll see a sidebar that has save on it, and you can save. And then you can categorize it based on what you want to categorize it. I sometimes just do like a blanket want to go, and that way as I get recommendations, I put that in there. You can do specific trips. On the phone, it's pretty much the same thing. You find the location and then you drop a pin there, and you can even add a note if you'd like on these pins to like sometimes when I do restaurants, I'll know what another traveler told me is the greatest thing to get there, for example. The thing about the Google Map method is that you'll want to make sure you have plans for data once you arrive. So we have Google Fi, so that covers us a lot when we travel, although they do cut you off after a couple months in Latin America, we learned. And so then you can also just get SIM cards, which is what we switched over to. And honestly, it's so much cheaper too to just get a local SIM card. I don't know why, because we're from the US and they charge just a ton for data, but other countries it's definitely not as expensive. So you can do that easily with an unlocked phone and just buying a local SIM card and refilling it as you go. You can also just download these maps offline and use it. I have had a little bit of difficulty with that. I also have always had data, so maybe it's just been the competing between the offline maps and the online maps. I don't know. A quick note for people who are doing a long-term travel trip is that you're not gonna be able to flesh out every activity of every place you go before you leave. Like that would just, I feel like, be so overwhelming, and your plans might change as you travel. So I would recommend just thinking about a few big activities you want to do in each location. So for example, when Alex and I were planning our around the world trip, we were going to Indonesia first. We knew we wanted to see the orangutans, we knew we wanted to see the Komodo dragons, and we knew we wanted to go scuba diving in Raja Ampat. So those were our big activities, and they are spread out. So we knew we needed a good chunk of time because of that. So I do think it's helpful to have at least a few activities when you're planning an around the world trip in each location, just to get an idea of time. But planning is just a constant part of the around the world trip process. It'd be impossible to plan everything for a year plus around the world trip. So once you have your pins in Google Maps, this is where you can start a spreadsheet. And that's what we do, is we have a spreadsheet with the day and then the activities. And so we really try to plan out our days, and those pins really help us know, okay, so this day, for example, because these activities are close together, we're going to put that on the same day. One thing I would note is just pay special close attention to the hours of operation. Just because it might work in your schedule best doesn't mean the hours of operation will necessarily work with you. There are certain days that things are closed, so just keep that in mind. So one thing as you're building out this spreadsheet is I would add buffer time into your schedule. So this allows for some spontaneity, and it also gives you some downtime. Like if you're on an around the world trip, everyone I talk to eventually gets burnt out. It just happens. It's part of the process, and you need to give yourself some buffer time, downtime. Doesn't mean you're not going to necessarily do anything that day. I would just give yourself a day or two a week where you have nothing planned. And if you're on a short trip, maybe like if it's 1 week, give yourself like half a day to a day. If it's a 2-week trip, give yourself a couple day buffer time, just because you never know what's going to come up. You could get sick. There could be horrible weather on one of the days you had planned this epic trek. So just allow some buffer time if you can in your schedule. Okay, another thing as you're fleshing this out is to think about if any of these activities need to be booked ahead of time. Most activities I find you can just book on site, and I prefer that because I like the flexibility. However, some things like if you wanted to do the Inca trek, for example, or like seeing the catacombs in Paris, you want to book those ahead of time because those things fill up. We had experience with that recently, and the catacombs in Paris. So now let's talk about transportation. A lot of places you can book transportation on the go. However, there are some situations where you definitely want to book that transportation ahead of time, especially if you have like a pre-booked tour or trek and you want to make sure you get to that place on time. Definitely, I'd recommend booking that ahead of time, especially if you have limited time. I think that would alleviate some stress if you have some of your transportation booked, especially if you have big activities you want to do. If you're not on a super strict schedule, most transportation can be booked the day of or the day before. No problems, we find. It gives you some flexibility for other things that come up, bad weather, sickness, etc. I think it's always good to have some flexibility if you can. All right, next section, accommodations. Another reason why I find Google Maps super helpful for this is that you can base your accommodations around the major activities you want to see. So if you notice that like everything is clustered in one part of the city, you know maybe to book an accommodation near those sites. Sometimes this is not always possible. Like when we visited Iguazu Falls, the only hotel like right in the park area was insanely expensive. So instead we tried to book a hotel near the bus station that would take you to Iguazu Falls. So definitely just kind of do a little research there, flush out where the activities are and try to book there. If not, try to book near transportation would be my advice. So Alex and I usually only book 2 or 3 nights ahead of time at a place just because we like that flexibility, but we also, at this point, have flexible schedules. So if you're on a tight schedule, I totally understand wanting to book out a week or so, but we find that we like to book the first 3 nights just to allow some flexibility. If you're on a long-term travel trip, I really don't recommend booking all your accommodation ahead of time. I think I've only met someone, like one person, who had booked like 3 months of their like planned trip ahead of time, and that really like locks them into a schedule, and that's not something that you really necessarily want with a long-term travel trip because you hear about other recommendations and sometimes you might decide to stay extra long in a place, and if you're locked in with like booked accommodations, it's gonna rush you a bit. So I wouldn't recommend that. Another thing to note, if you're wanting to stay in like a unique accommodation, which I know is really popular right now, that you might need to book ahead of time. Like let's say you want to stay at a tree house in the woods, that you're probably going to have to just book ahead of time and then plan your schedule around that. But overall, I think if you're comfortable with having some flexibility in your schedule, even with like a 2-week trip, I think that it's better not to book too much accommodation ahead of time because you never know what's going to come up. I know Alex and I have gone sick on our trips and we've had bad weather affect like our whole plan. So if you can and you're comfortable with only booking 2 to 3 nights initially, that is definitely what I would recommend. Another category, food, is definitely not going to be applicable to everyone because not everyone's like foodies when they travel. But for me, I love to be able to try local foods while I'm traveling. So I like to do some research on that ahead of time. So what I usually do for this is I just research like top foods in X destination. And then I look at several blogs to get ideas of the types of food they have. And then I start putting a list of like my top ones I want to see. Once you create like a list of the types of foods you want to try, that is where I usually go onto Google Maps and I Google search the different food options and I try to find one. It's added bonus if I can find them near my already pinned saved activities I want to do because then that will be easier for me to get to. I'll even note the item in the notes section that I want to try. I also get a lot of my food recommendations from like social media. As I see people pin places that they really like, I pin it on my Google Maps. If you don't want to deal with the whole pinning of things ahead of time, totally understand. Sometimes just chatting with the hotel and hostel staff can give you some really good food recommendations. And then also just noticing like in certain countries, if there's like a big street food scene, seeing where all the locals are kind of gathered around stalls can really give you an idea of what's popular there. And usually if it's popular with the locals, it's going to be really good. If you have any dietary needs, this is also good to do some research before you get there because, you know, if you're not used to the type of food that they make, they might add, like, let's say if you're celiac, they might add gluten to things that you might not think of, and some parts of the world might not be familiar with your type of dietary restriction. So I always think it's good to kind of list out in detail the types of food you cannot eat. So I definitely would recommend if you have dietary restrictions to do some research ahead of time. All right, so that's pretty much my planning process. Just some takeaways. I would, if you can, allow some flexibility in your schedule. I think that will really help reduce some stress in case weather or sickness comes up, which almost always seems to happen, it feels like. If you don't have time to do this whole planning process, I get it. It's not for everybody. Just note that like talking with hostels and hotels and other locals on site is a great resource for like completely up-to-date information, and I always recommend doing that as well. Honestly, it's so common among travelers. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people where they're like, oh, what's your favorite thing how long have you been here? What's your favorite thing you've done here? It's just travelers love to talk about travel, so you'll find that people are probably very open to talking about their trip. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you guys do anything else with your planning. I hope this makes the planning process a little less intimidating. Let me know if you have any questions down below, and we'll see you on our next video.